Pisces, how many times have you sat in silence, feeling that something wasn't quite right, and yet still wondering if maybe you were thinking too much? You sensed the disconnect in the words, in the eyes, in the pauses that were hard to name. And then, you chose silence. Because you believe in kindness, because you believe that, somehow, everything will eventually reveal itself. But the truth is, a Pisces intuition rarely speaks without a reason. Those vague feelings were never weakness. They were signals, quiet ones, whispers you've been hearing for a very long time. Only now, they no longer want to be ignored. In this story, no one is being judged. There is only truth, and when it arrives at the right moment, it steps into the light on its own. And right now, let's begin with this simple understanding. You were never wrong for trusting what you felt deep inside, Pisces. If you're listening to these words right now, there's a chance you've been carrying a feeling that's hard to name. Not exactly sadness, not quite disappointment. More like a thin layer of mist settling over your mind. You keep living. You keep smiling. You keep showing up for the roles you're expected to play. And yet, somewhere inside, there's this quiet sense that something hasn't been said, hasn't been fully understood, hasn't been brought into the light. And you start to wonder if you're being too sensitive, if you're overthinking, if you're making things harder for yourself than they need to be. The truth is, so many Pisces have felt this way before, a feeling that's soft, almost gentle, but persistent, like small waves touching the shore in the middle of the night. All not loud, not dramatic, just steady enough that you can't ignore it. Your intuition doesn't arrive like a bold declaration. It doesn't label things as right or wrong. It simply whispers, very quietly, that something needs to be looked at again, that something deserves slower attention, deeper listening. There were times you chose to brush that feeling aside. You told yourself to be more generous, more understanding, to trust that everything would eventually work itself out. You grew used to placing other people's emotions first, used to keeping the peace, used to soothing your own heart instead of asking the harder questions. And because of that, you learned how to endure in silence, even when parts of you didn't quite fit together anymore. But that silence was never weakness. It's the nature of a deep soul. That Pisces doesn't experience life on the surface. You feel it in layers. Through subtle currents most people never notice. Sometimes you can't explain why you feel uneasy. You just know the feeling is real, and that it showed up for a reason, even if that reason doesn't need a name yet. At some point in growing up, everyone has to learn how to trust themselves again. Not through toughness, but through honesty with their emotions. What you've been sensing all this time may not be the full truth. Or maybe it's the first piece of a much larger picture you're only beginning to see. And what matters isn't reaching a conclusion, but allowing yourself to listen instead of pushing that feeling away. Pisces often turns inward with self-blame. You tell yourself you should be stronger, more rational, less affected. But maybe what you really need isn't to change your nature, but to respect it. Intuition isn't something to fight against. It's a part of you, shaped by experience, by observation, by quiet heartbreaks and silent healing. When you slow down and look inward, you begin to see that this feeling wasn't meant to scare you. It came to remind you to live more slowly, more truthfully with yourself. It doesn't ask you to act right away. It doesn't force a decision. It asks for just one small thing, that you don't turn your back on your inner voice. And maybe right now, as you hear these words, you're wondering if you can trust that feeling one more time, not to be right, not to prove anything to anyone, but simply to not betray yourself. Because sometimes the bravest thing isn't moving forward. It's admitting you've known this feeling for a very long time. And from that quiet admission, your story truly begins. The woman in this story didn't appear as a clear figure from the beginning. She arrived softly, familiar, almost like a natural part of a space you once believed was safe. There was nothing loud about her, nothing dramatic, no obvious warning signs that told you to be on guard. And yet, over time, you began to sense a strange layer of energy surrounding her. Not necessarily negative, but unfinished, like a room that had been closed for too long, lacking light, lacking air. You may have wondered why you felt that way. She didn't do anything clearly wrong. On the surface, everything seemed fine. Her words were gentle, her smile was still there, her attention appeared at the right moments. but in the smallest pauses, and in the stories that were never fully told, in the moments when eye contact was avoided, you sensed an inconsistency, as if something was always being held back, never fully placed on the table. What's important to understand is that this kind of hiding doesn't always come from a desire to hurt someone. Often people hide the most from themselves. She may have grown used to not fully facing her emotions, used to keeping everything within a safe range, used to not naming the things that made her uneasy. And when someone isn't honest with themselves, that inner conflict naturally spills outward, no matter how carefully they try to cover it. Pisces tends to feel these things clearly, not through logic, but through a very subtle vibration. You don't need proof. You don't need confirmation. Simply being close is enough for you to feel when the energy doesn't flow evenly. Words and actions don't always align. Silence shows up exactly when something needs to be said. And the most important stories are quietly passed over, as if they never existed. There were times you defended her, even to yourself. You told yourself that everyone has private corners, things they are not ready to share. You chose to respect that distance, because you understand the need for protection. But deep down, you also sensed that this wasn't just privacy. It was a curtain that had been kept in place for too long, one that began to distort the connection between you. When hiding lasts too long, it creates a very specific kind of energy. It doesn't explode, it doesn't create obvious conflict. It simply wears you down, quietly. You start to doubt yourself. You wonder if you're thinking too much, if you're expecting too much, if you're seeing the person incorrectly. And somewhere along the way, you forget that your original feelings showed up for a very real reason. The truth is, no curtain can be held forever without gaps appearing. Hidden energy, no matter how refined, slowly erodes with time. Small details stop fitting together. Answers become more circular. Presence becomes inconsistent. And you, without actively searching, begin to notice the empty spaces more clearly. She may not be ready to face her own truth. She may still be trying to maintain a familiar image, because change always carries uncertainty. But at this point, the curtain no longer stands the way it once did. Not because someone exposed it, but because what's real cannot stay hidden forever. And for Pisces, recognizing this isn't about judging or reaching a conclusion. It's a quiet moment of clarity where you understand that real connection can only exist when both sides are willing to live honestly with themselves. From here, the story moves into a deeper layer, a space where what was hidden slowly gives way to clearer signs, even if they arrive gently and very slowly. Truth, if it can even be called that, rarely arrives through loud moments or heavy collisions. It doesn't knock insistently. It doesn't force anyone to face it all at once. For Pisces, truth tends to arrive slowly, quietly, like early morning light slipping through a small crack in the door before you're fully awake. At first, it's just a familiar feeling returning, something that suddenly feels clearer inside, even if you can't explain it in words yet. Maybe it's a small detail you once overlooked, a sentence that seemed casual, but lingered in your mind longer than it should have, an action that didn't quite match an old promise, a silence that lasted longer than necessary. On their own, these things may not mean much, but as time passes, you begin to notice they are no longer scattered. They start finding each other, lining up, quietly forming a picture you've sensed for a very long time. Pisces doesn't rush toward conclusions. You allow things to exist in the gray for a while, because you understand how complex people are, and how no one is just one thing. But that same patience eventually shows you the difference between understanding someone and losing touch with your own perception. When truth begins to surface, you're not shocked. You feel something familiar instead. As if you've known this all along, you just weren't ready to name it yet. What's interesting is that clarity doesn't come from someone finally saying everything out loud. It comes from consistency, or more precisely, from inconsistency that can no longer be disguised. Stories begin to contradict themselves. Reasons stop holding up when placed side by side. And you, guided by your own quiet intuition, start to feel that you don't need more proof. Not because you're certain, but because you're calm enough to accept what's slowly revealing itself. There's a very peaceful moment in this process, the moment you stop asking why you feel the way you do. You stop trying to correct your emotions. You stop telling yourself to be more positive, to let more things slide. Instead, you allow yourself to stand still and observe. is to watch how things arrange themselves, to notice how truth doesn't need words to be exposed, but reveals itself through the rhythm of time. For Pisces, truth is not a verdict. It doesn't arrive with anger or a sense of victory. It arrives with a relief that's hard to describe. Relief because you no longer have to live in prolonged uncertainty. Relief because you no longer doubt yourself. What appears may not be perfect. It may not be easy to accept, but at least it's real. And truth, even when it comes gently, always carries the power to set you free. You might not call this an ending. You might see it as a marker instead. A place where you pause and look back at the road you've traveled. The doubts that once exhausted you now serve as reminders that you were always listening closely. Not to judge anyone else, but to understand your own place in this story. Truth revealing itself doesn't demand immediate action. It doesn't push you toward big decisions. It simply places in your hands just enough clarity so you no longer have to keep walking in the dark. And sometimes that alone is the greatest gift. Because when things are no longer unclear, you can begin choosing your path with more honesty, with a lighter heart. From here on, your journey no longer revolves around searching for answers. It becomes about learning to live in harmony with what you've come to understand, little by little, in the quiet, deep rhythm that belongs uniquely to Pisces. And then, at a very quiet, very ordinary moment, you begin to realize that the center of this story was never really about that woman. She may have been a catalyst. She may have been a necessary crossing, but what's unfolding more deeply is the movement happening inside you. Pisces is no longer standing in the place of someone waiting for answers. You're slowly becoming an observer of yourself, more calm, more patient, and more honest than before. Inner awakening doesn't arrive as a sudden burst of light. It's more like waking up after a long sleep and noticing that the light in the room has changed. There's no alarm, no dramatic announcement. You just start to feel that you no longer want to live in that suspended, half-awake state. You begin paying closer attention to your feelings, not to analyze them, but simply to listen. Maybe for the first time in a long while, you allow yourself to question boundaries. You begin to understand that love doesn't mean endless endurance. Either that understanding doesn't mean erasing yourself from the story. You start to see that your worth isn't measured by how much you can tolerate, but by whether you respect yourself enough to not remain in places that leave you constantly doubting or quietly exhausted. Pisces has always had a way of dissolving into other people's emotions. You empathize easily. You step into the other person's shoes naturally. You overlook small signals to preserve surface peace. But this awakening brings a very subtle shift. You don't become colder, you become clearer. Clear with yourself about what you can accept and what you no longer want to carry. During this process, you may feel a sense of emptiness. When the layers of confusion fall away, the space that appears is not a sign of loss. It's room for something new. A space where you no longer need to explain your feelings to anyone. A space where you can admit that you've grown, not by becoming harder, but by becoming more honest about your own limits. Truth, when it stands beside those who are willing to face it, doesn't promise a beautiful or easy outcome. But it does offer stability. You no longer have to constantly adjust yourself to fit situations that no longer fit you. You begin to understand that peace doesn't come from perfection, but from no longer betraying the deepest feelings inside you. You may still care, you may still love, you may still hold emotions you haven't named yet. Awakening doesn't ask you to deny those feelings. It simply invites you to place them where they belong, not at the center, not controlling your entire inner world, just a part of your growth. Pisces. As you begin to see your own value more clearly, you also start attracting experiences that reflect that clarity. Not immediately, not loudly, but little by little, you'll notice that you're no longer as easily pulled into inconsistent connections. Not because you're more guarded, but because you understand what you need to feel at peace. At this point, truth is no longer something you have to chase or prove. It becomes the foundation that allows you to move forward with a slower pace, a deeper rhythm, and a more honest way of living. Not to rise above anyone else, but to avoid losing yourself ever again. This isn't the end of the story. It's the moment you stand firmly within your own inner world, ready to step into what comes next, with the clarity and gentleness that only Pisces knows how to carry. When the truth becomes clear enough that you no longer have to keep questioning, the illusions that once existed begin to retreat quietly. There is no dramatic collapse, no intense moment that tightens your chest. Just one ordinary morning when you suddenly realize you're no longer holding on to the things that once kept you restless, the vague hopes, the unfinished explanations, the stories you used to tell yourself to keep everything from slipping away. They all seem to lose their weight. Illusions don't disappear because they're shattered, but because you no longer need them. When you look long enough, deep enough, you realize you once tried to believe in a more beautiful version of the truth. Not because you were naive, but because you wanted to believe things could turn out differently. Pisces often loves as much with imagination as with the heart. You see potential, you see what could become, and sometimes you forget to look directly at what already is. But at this point, you no longer blame yourself for that. You understand that those illusions once helped you survive difficult seasons. They gave you hope when you weren't ready for clarity. And so, when they fall away, you don't feel bitterness. You feel a deep sense of relief, like setting down a suitcase you've been carrying for far too long. There's no need to argue because arguments only happen when we still want to convince someone. No need to prove anything because proof is only required when we still doubt ourselves. Here, things end in a quiet understanding. You don't need more explanations. You don't need a perfect apology. You only need enough clarity to not return to the same old cycles. This ending doesn't feel like loss. It feels like tidying up. You gently fold away the memories that once made you hesitate, place them where they belong, in the past, and stop carrying them as part of the present. You realize that some things were very real for you at one time, but no longer fit the person you're becoming. And that doesn't make them wrong. It simply means they've fulfilled their purpose. Pisces, there is a very quiet strength in no longer being held by what isn't real anymore. When you no longer have to explain contradictions, you gain more energy to care for your inner life. When you no longer have to maintain fragile illusions, you gain more space to breathe, to rest, to slow down. The decisiveness here is not cold or harsh, it's gentle clarity. You don't slam the door, you simply close it softly and turn toward the light. You understand that not every story needs a dramatic ending. Some stories only need to be released at the right moment so you can continue living more fully. As illusions dissolve, you also learn something essential. That truth, even when it isn't comfortable, is a stronger foundation than any uncertain hope. That you don't need to cling to what's unclear to prove your kindness or your loyalty. Your worth isn't measured by how long you stay, but by whether you respect yourself enough to leave when something no longer nourishes your soul. And in this gentle yet decisive ending, Pisces doesn't lose anything that truly belongs to them. Instead, you reclaim so much: peace, self-respect, and a new sense of steadiness. Knowing that you can move forward without looking back at what is no longer real. This is not the closing of the heart. It's the opening of a more honest way of living. A chapter where you no longer carry the illusions that once slowed you down on your own journey. Pisces. If you follow this story all the way to its end, the most important thing to carry with you may not be a conclusion, but a very gentle acknowledgement you offer to yourself. You were not lying, not in your emotions, not in your intuition, and not in the way you loved, the way you believed, the way you chose to stay. What you felt was never meaningless. It was simply waiting for the right moment to be seen, with more calm, more maturity. Pisces' intuition is not loud. It isn't extreme. It doesn't pull you forward with fear, and it doesn't push you into rushed decisions. It guides you through very small, very real sensations, just enough to keep you from losing yourself in relationships, in stories, in expectations that no longer fit who you are. And if today you're here, listening to these words, perhaps that intuition has already done its job, not to prove anything, but to bring you to a necessary pause. Truth, when it appears, doesn't always feel comfortable, but it rarely comes to harm you. It comes to release you, to free you from cycles of doubt, from constantly asking where you went wrong or what you were missing, to free you from the weight of trying to hold on to something that is no longer real, just because you once hoped it could be. Pisces carries a wide heart. You forgive easily, you empathize deeply. You see goodness even when it's fragile, but that wide heart also needs protection. Not with high walls, but with clarity. Clarity about what you deserve. Clarity about the fact that you don't have to sacrifice your peace to prove your kindness or your loyalty. The new chapter you're stepping into doesn't promise perfection. It doesn't guarantee that everything will be easy or complete, but it carries something precious, the peace that comes from no longer living against your own inner knowing. You no longer need to explain your feelings so that others can understand them. You only need to respect them enough to not hurt yourself again. There may still be questions ahead without clear answers. There may still be moments when you look back and wonder if things could have turned out differently. That's normal. Growing doesn't mean the absence of memory. It means knowing where memory belongs. Not letting it pull you backward, but allowing it to remind you of what you've lived through and what you've learned. The final message for Pisces is not to become stronger and not to close your heart. It's simply this: continue living honestly. Honest with your emotions, honest with your limits, honest with your need for peace. When you live this way, what no longer fits will quietly fall away, and what is meant for you will arrive in its own natural time. You don't have to rush into the next chapter. Just know that the door is already open. You can pause a little longer, breathe, feel the lightness that's finally there, and when you're ready, you'll step forward, not with doubt, but with a very quiet trust. Trust that you listened well, trust that you weren't lying, and trust that peace, in the way only Pisces understands, is beginning to take shape from that honesty itself.